Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, we have some amazing dumpster fire stories. I've been having a blast recording Season 3. Today, we're going to examine what happens when the locker room talk in the operating room can ignite a dumpster fire on a doctor's career.
So is this different than last week's episode when we talked about private parts becoming public?
Well, there's some similarities. This one is less visual and more raunchy.
All right. Well, I swear the worst side effects of all these crazy stories we keep telling is I feel like my inner dad joke alarms keep going off, and I feel like I should share some of those with the audience.
Oh, Brad, I want to paint the visual to the audience with you and your jeans and your white New Balance with grass stains all over them as you gear up. Kind of using a Star Wars analogy, it's almost like the Force is with you, except the Force for you is really bad dad jokes. I think you've even been trying to rebrand them as Brad jokes, which is kind of a dad joke in of itself.
It is.
So at the risk of causing an earthquake from the cumulative cringing by our listeners, the floor is yours for a few. And Brad, just a couple Brad jokes.
Yes. You will not regret this, Michael. Michael, why can't T-Rex clap?
Why?
Because he's extinct. God. Michael, did you hear about the new book I'm reading? It's on anti-gravity. It's impossible to put down. Nothing on that one? Come on. Michael, 3 guys walk into a bar. You think the third one would see it coming.
Man.
Nothing? Oh, man. Okay. No more. I know. Hopefully our audience is still with us. All right. What do dad jokes, if anything, have to do with today's story?
Well, I successfully stayed quiet during all of that because I didn't want to give the reaction I was thinking. But I do feel really known right now because now the audience has a little bit of a glimpse of what life at ByrdAdatto is like. And so the question is, does this have to do with today's story? No, unless it's a sailor telling dad jokes.
Okay.
We'll be shifting from your G-rated, really bad jokes to X-rated conversations quickly as we move to the story today.
All right, I'm curious. Let's jump in today's story.
Well, this is one of the few stories that started before you and I worked together.
So like billion years ago.
A really long time ago, Brad. The dumpster fire burned so long that we were still dealing with it 4 years after it started when you and I did start working together.
Yeah, I definitely remember jumping in on this one early on. We had just started working together, and this dumpster fire was going pretty well when I got in there. So tell us how did it start?
The entire story stemmed from a 15-minute conversation in the operating room between our client, who's a surgeon, and his OR team helping with the case. For purposes of this story, we will be calling our client Dr. Sailor.
I think that's a very appropriate name for him. And I think for context, we should let the talk about the culture of operating rooms, or also known in the medical community as ORs. And whether it's shared stress or performing an operation, their sheer amount of time they get to spend together, or the combination of the two, there's this unique bond or culture that is formed in these OR rooms.
Yeah, we have countless stories over the years of incidents that happen in the OR, and they're ranging the full range of, surgeons who are stressed and start screaming at people and causes that kind of environment to what happened here with Dr. Sailor. We'll get into in a minute. But generally the surgeons kind of tend to form a wolf pack and operate with the same anesthesiologists, the same nurses, and other team members whenever possible.
Yeah, there's a lot of energy in their particular OR teams, and it obviously can vary from OR room to OR room.
And like I mentioned, this is no different. Dr. Sailor and most of his OR team happened to be single back when this happened. Someone innocently posed a question for the room about a dream date.
Okay, this is the part where I think we can cue the foreboding music, and it gets scary. And the question akin to someone pouring, in this case, gasoline into the dumpster, and then we're waiting around for someone to throw the first match in.
Well, we know it was Dr. Saylor who hurled a pack of matches into the dumpster. The conversation went from flirty and fun about the dream date to raunchy real fast. This was a tight-knit group and not their first naughty conversation.
All right, so this begs the question, if they're so tight-knit and there's this little wolf pack, like almost like a little fraternity itself, how would this conversation ever leave the room?
Great question, and thankfully, this is not one of those creepy stories where the patient's lying there conscious and hearing the whole thing. Another common dynamic is that there are routinely visitors in the OR. They can be medical device reps or hospital staff, and the visitors tend to be truly like the proverbial fly on the wall. The OR team is often not even aware that there are visitors in the room.
Yeah, and so what happened in here?
Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, there was a hospital employee in the room. She heard the entire conversation, including some pretty descriptive language about what Dr. Saylor viewed as a perfect first date.
Ah, of course. Now, Dr. Saylor, that's kind of when we still, I still wasn't there, but I do know who Dr. Saylor is, and subtleness is not his specialty.
No, I mean, he says what he means and means what he says, and when you're having a raunchy conversation, there's no room for interpretation.
Not in that one.
Yes. And so the hospital employee was uncomfortable and decided to call the hospital harassment hotline.
All right, so typically an incident like this, there may be some questions or perhaps some training that the hospital now will require in this case, this physician, Dr. Saylor, to undertake.
Yeah, I mean, usually just to add on to that, I mean, there might be an inquiry or an investigation, and like you said, the outcomes are usually, in the grand scheme of things, a hand slap to try to correct things, and that would have been a happy ending if that's what had actually happened here. Dr. Saylor, in this case, a few days later, received notice that his privileges at the hospital were temporarily suspended, and then, before he could even kind of get his arms around that, a few hours later, he received a letter terminating his role as medical director for the surgical department that he oversaw.
That's crazy aggressive. Why was it so extreme in this case?
Well, what we know now, or then not long after that, is that the hospital wanted to clean up the culture in the ORs and was looking to make an example out of Dr. Saylor. We had a few-week period right when this went down where the outcome could potentially have derailed his career, and even with a good result was going to be damaging.
Yeah, this is a massive dumpster fire. Dr. Saylor, maybe normally his mom would try to wash his mouth out with some soap, but that didn't happen this time. The hospital obviously sounds like they opened up some type of investigation, and it seems like there may be some other ripple effects. And probably we should dive in some of those legal risks, but let's do that after the break.
Perfect.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
And welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto. I'm still here with my co-host, Michael Byrd. And Michael, we just heard this story about Dr. Saylor using his salty language, which landed him in the middle of a massive dumpster fire here. And what happened with the hospital?
Yeah, and so, one thing, as we were kind of talking about this story, you and I offline started just reliving, kind of the stuff that we know about and talking just more in depth about just the degree of conversation that happens in these operating rooms. And one thing that I remembered at the time is that this, wolf pack that Dr. Saylor was in was so tight knit that Dr. Saylor was immediately just like, why this conversation? Like, he was like, I have had a half a dozen conversations in the last month that were 10 times worse than this.
Yeah, and both of us, we grew up in the world where our dads were both surgeons, and we would hear some of the stories that would happen in these rooms. And then as we grew, we heard more of the stories. We went from the jokes they heard that could be told in front of the kids to the jokes that were heard that could be told in front of adults. And there's some raunchy stuff that happens in these rooms. So it's not just Dr. Saylor. It's pretty strong throughout the communities.
Yeah, and one of the things that if you listen to all the episodes, and it certainly comes up every week when we're having calls with clients, is they're routinely like, how's everybody else getting away with this?
Yeah.
And this is yet another example of, well, you did get away with it until you didn't.
Yes.
And you don't usually when someone, turns you in.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to our story right now with Dr. Saylor. So what did happen?
So Dr. Saylor had a crazy 2-week period, and we can talk a little bit about that, where he learns this news. His world is turned upside down instantly. And, I'm on the phone with him trying to figure out what to happen. And this 2-week period is that he has to have a hearing for his temporary suspension within 2 weeks. And during that time, his practice was effectively closed because he was not allowed to work at the hospital.
Yeah, and just for context, for those who are hearing a story like this for the first time, there's a ton of different things that happen if there's a temporary suspension, and that we'll talk about throughout this episode. But one of the things is that typically when a hospital or someone else, when they do decide to put someone on temporary suspension, it's because a patient care is in jeopardy. So typically it's because the person's impaired or something else. This kind of suspension is very unusual because there's such a big ramification for doing it. In fact, one of the issues that they're faced with is if there is a suspension for a certain period, that's reportable to the National Practitioner Data Bank.
Yeah, and so first, for those of you who are not familiar with the National Practitioner Data Bank, it is a data bank operated by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that contains medical malpractice payment and adverse action reports on all sorts of healthcare professionals. And as we've mentioned in other episodes, when it's like when you were little and you were in school and they said your parents would say this will go on your permanent record. This is truly the doctor's version of the permanent record. And I'll just add, Brad, and you've been through this before. I mean, the process when this started, begins with, okay, you've got two issues to deal with. One is this temporary suspension, and so we're looking at the bylaws and figuring out what his administrative law rights are under the hospital bylaws for him to defend himself.
Right, and this is every single hospital will have a different bylaws.
Yes, yeah, and there's a lot of protection to the hospitals on what they can and can't do in these circumstances because they're considered, getting a little technical, quasi-governmental entities. So they have this concept called immunity, and so when you're the doctor in this situation, you have to be really careful about how you fight these fights because it pretty much ends with whatever they decide. And then we have that going on, which threatens, not just his career at this hospital, but the rest of his career, because you lose privileges at a hospital and good luck, when you go to your next gig. You're never going to get the primo opportunities. And at the same time, we kind of mentioned this medical director contract, and this was a lucrative contract for Dr. Saylor to be the medical director over this department in the hospital, and that was terminated. And so we're looking at is there anything that can be done there? What does life look like after that?
And again, this is all happening in a 2-week period. So you're talking about life in the fast lane, that all these things are happening. So let's kind of help our audience move a little bit further in this one because the dumpster fire will continue. What did happen with the hospital?
So our approach, or Dr. Saylor's approach, was to come in very much hat in hand and, just basically to kind of explained that he would learned his lesson, he'd be more respectful, all of those things. His privileges were restored, and Dr. Saylor had to meet a bunch of conditions that essentially would be the training type stuff that we mentioned and going to see a counselor. And they basically wanted some assurance that he was making changes to behave better in the future. And because the temporary suspension was lifted so quickly, the event was not reportable to the data bank, as we just talked about. So unfortunately, this was the only good news. And it really was, in some respects, managing the dumpster fire from spinning out of control because of the impact it could have had to his career. But make no mistake, we had a dumpster fire, and as we'll talk, it burned for quite some time. He did not get his medical directorship back. This was a big blow, both professionally and economically. And Dr. Saylor ended up staying with this hospital, and to this day is part of the same hospital system.
Yeah, that's scary. But not as bad as an outcome as we built it up to be. Except remember, I joined you 4 years later, and Dr. Saylor was still dealing with the ripple effects. Let's talk about what happens 4 years later.
Well, remember, we spoke about reporting issues. Every time Dr. Saylor renewed his malpractice, his hospital privileges, or applied for new privileges, he was put through the ringer over this incident.
Yeah, right. Because even though it's not part of the permanent record that everyone else in the world can see, is not listed with the National Practitioner Data Bank, he still had these contractual obligations when you're filling out these applications saying, have you ever been suspended? So each time he had to say yes. And the concept here is, to understand is once you can't unring that bell once they suspend you as a medical provider. It's a big issue that a lot of hospitals don't realize the impact that's going to have on those docs for long term.
Yeah, and to that point, 4 years after the incident, Dr. Saylor received a letter from the Texas Medical Board. They were investigating him for unprofessional conduct relating to the same incident. The good news, Brad, was that this was an informal investigation.
Michael, you're triggering me. I can hear it in your voice. We both know there's nothing informal about these letters or these investigations. So for the audience, typically a medical board will send a letter noting a complaint has been filed against you, the provider. This is the first step in determining if the medical board should open an investigation. But many providers see the word informal, and they attempt to answer it themselves, not realizing there's nothing, I repeat, nothing informal about your response. This is your first opportunity to clearly to explain to the investigator why there's no reason to continue, and that the complaint should just go away and be dismissed on its face.
So here, thanks for the clarification, Brad, continuing with our dumpster fire story, the medical board decided to turn this into an investigation. The next step in the process was the informal settlement conference. They invited our client to attend this informal settlement conference in Austin. So Brad, go ahead. Get back on your soapbox.
I never left my soapbox, and I know you use the word informal twice purposely. There's nothing, again, informal about this. Licenses are on the line at this informal settlement conference. It's really a mini trial. Again, those for not familiar with it, the medical board will have an attorney there. They will be the prosecuting attorney who's going to try to prosecute you on these potential violations that they outline in their investigation. And depending on your state, there's going to either be 3 to 5 people in that room. Sometimes they're medical doctors. In other states, they're medical doctor and lay people. And they are both the judge and jury. Once this hearing is over, the panel will meet with you guys outside the room. So there could be an hour or 30 minutes. And they will develop a recommendation. And that recommendation could be, we're going to dismiss all charges. We're going to publicly admonish you. We're going to temporarily or fully suspend you, or we're just taking your license altogether and, you're done. Now, this panel is not actually the final word. They still have to then submit it to the full board for their approval. But those of us who've been in the industry long enough know 99.999% of the time, whatever this panel comes up and recommends in this informal conference is what the medical board adopts. So there is, Michael, nothing informal about this settlement conference.
You really do like that soapbox, Brad. Yeah, and just to add on to that, your rights administratively don't end at this trial. If you have a bad outcome, the doctor can then really appeal it into litigation. And you're talking typically the worst of the worst scenarios where there's been really bad patient care or substance abuse that the doctor's not dealing with. So it really does, in effect, make this informal settlement conference the final outcome. Almost in every case that we deal with, that's the end of the road. And, the doctor, gets what they get, and they know it's just not worth it pursuing it beyond that. Dr. Saylor ended up spending thousands of dollars preparing for this TMB hearing. Both of us flew to Austin to meet with the medical board.
So how did it turn out?
Well, thankfully, Dr. Saylor was in a different place, and with the right preparation, came to the medical board with the right strategy.
Was that strategy guns a-blazing and telling them all to stick it up their wazoos?
Yes. So we both have seen the litigators come to the rescue on these medical board hearings and end up getting their doctors the worst possible outcome.
Yes.
It was quite the opposite. The panel before the medical board wants to understand all the information, and they want to see contrition by the doctor if they made a mistake. So here our approach was to come in, again, hat in hand, so to speak, and talk about the fact that this happened 4 years ago, and talk about the consequences that Dr. Saylor had already experienced. They got to live in the dumpster fire of what he had already been through, and then, of course, talk about what lessons he's learned.
Did this work?
Yes. They dismissed the case completely. It was actually a dismissal on the spot, which was a great relief. It was a minor victory in what was a nightmare of a dumpster fire story. Dr. Saylor lost a ton of time and money to have this case dismissed.
Yeah, and that's the crazy thing about the time and effort that they had to put into these things. And it all stemmed from this 15-minute conversation in the OR that happened years ago. So, Michael, what are some of your final takeaways for the day?
Well, the world's different now too, Brad. We're living in a compliance culture, and we all know about the Me Too movement, and so if we're going to talk in terms of business risk and compliance risk, the risk is higher now. If you find yourself in a situation where you think it's just you and your wolf pack, understand that this is a professional setting, and there's real consequences that can go with not kind of being aware of your surroundings. Brad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. What people think happens in the OR stays in the OR. That's not the case in situations like that. So when you're having fun with your team, remember, you must keep it professional. And so because you don't want to open yourself up to investigations from hospitals or boards. And so, it may be in your mind perceived innocent bantering back and forth, but in reality, you do have to keep your brain in check. And then as I get off my soapbox here, we have been in this industry long enough, and I'm just hopefully reiterating this enough because I say it every single time I talk on this subject matter. Do not believe that anything is informal about these informal letters or informal investigations. You have to take them serious. Get with your healthcare attorney immediately. Do not sit on these things. As medical providers, you've worked really, really hard to obtain your license. So spend the time and money to find that right team to defend it. We talked about Wolfpack a lot, but one of the things we did in season 1 was talked about don't try to be a lone wolf because it's already difficult enough as it is. So don't be embarrassed. Don't think that this is not a reason to reach out to your help.
I saw what you did there. You tried to squeeze in another Brad joke, trying to tie the don't be a lone wolf to the wolf pack.
That's right.
Well done.
Yes. Well, Michael, that's all the time we have for today, but please join us for our final episode of Season 3 next Wednesday when we learn about when it's too good to be true. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.